This loving couple is living together after the recent death of their son. But after this young boy came to work in this house, things could not continue as they were, because this old woman, who was hurt by the death of her son, fell in love with this young worker of her husband when her husband left for work. Dear viewers, where do you think this secret love will go? Hello, my dear family. Peace be with you. Today I have brought you the most popular movie called The Door in the Floor, which was released in 2004. My family, please help us by liking the video. Without wasting time, let's go to the movie.
Yes!
The movie starts at a beach house on an island, where we meet a talented writer named Ted. Ted lives here with his wife Marion and their daughter Ruth. The wall of their house is covered with pictures of their sons, Tom and Tim. A few years ago, both of his sons died in a car crash. Marion couldn't handle this upsetting event, and ever since then, she has been living in sadness. On the other side, Ted is busy with his job. Ruth is looked after by her babysitter, Alice. Ruth learns about her brother's accident. Ruth always looks at the photos of her brothers who have passed away. One day, Ted gets a helper for himself. The assistant can help with little jobs and also drive for him. Ted's driving license was taken away 3 months ago. His name is Eddie. Then Ted talks to Marion about Eddie. Then these two have a chat for some time. We learn this by listening to what they say. Since his son died, their relationship has grown distant. Marion is in shock, so she doesn't say much. Seeing how their relationship is going, Ted tells Marion that they should take a break from each other for a while, and Marion says yes to it too, and goes to stay at a hotel in the city. That night, Ruth has a frightening dream. Ruth talks to Ted and tells him about her dream. Then Ted tells him a story and helps him fall asleep. Then Ted begins to write a book about Ruth's dream. The next morning, Marion goes to get Eddie. Today, Eddie was going to start his job as an assistant. Then Eddie comes over and sees that his wife has come to pick him up instead of Ted. When Eddie sees Marion, she thinks he is really good looking, and he likes her a lot too. Then Marion takes Eddie to Ted's house. Then she goes to her hotel. Then Ted meets Eddie, and Ted shares what he does for work. And Ted says this to him as well. You will need to live in this house from now on. Eddie really likes Ted a lot. Eddie wants to be a good writer like Ted. That's why Eddie is really glad to be here. Ted gives him a tour of the entire house. As he talks, he also shares that his marriage is getting worse. That's how Marion and he are living separately. Eddie next meets Alice, Ruth's babysitter. She was a lovely young woman. In addition to creating Ted books, he paints. He consistently creates paintings of girls without clothing. Additionally, Ted recruits Evelyn, a female, to serve as his model. Marion then arrives here the next day. Eddie follows him to the theater as well. It encounters Eddie Marion. He explains that he came here for supper, due to the fact that he doesn't bring food from Ted home. Marion tells him this after hearing it. One day, I want to take you out for dinner. That same night when Eddie returns home. Then he begins to pleasure himself after looking at Marion's photo. But then Ted and Ruth show up too, and Eddie just barely gets away. The next day, Marion comes here. After this, he goes home, finds Marion's underwear, and then starts to pleasure himself. But then Marion comes home and sees Eddie doing it. Marion apologizes to Eddie and says he should have visited earlier. Eddie felt very embarrassed about being caught like this. But Marion tells him she isn't mad at him and that everyone does this at his age. Eddie tells Marion that ever since he first saw her, he has been thinking about her. When Marion hears this, she stays quiet and doesn't say anything. The next day, when Eddie takes Ted to Evelyn's house, he sees that Marion has left her underwear behind. That evening, Marion goes out to dinner with Eddie, and they talk a lot. Marion asks Eddie why he doesn't take Alice out on a date. Eddie replies that Alice doesn't like him that way. After talking for a long time, they both go home. The next day, Marion visits Eddie's room and explains the story behind all the pictures on the walls. Marion flirts with Eddie, and then they get close to each other. The next day, Ted goes to a place with Eddie. There, Ted reads a book to 10 people. Eddie finds out from Ted's story that Ted writes all his books about his own life. After that, when he is going home, Ted thanks Eddie because ever since Eddie arrived, Marion has been happy again after a long time. A few days later, one night, Ruth goes to Marion's room and sees Eddie and Marion close together. When Ruth sees this, she begins to cry, and then Marion helps her feel better. Ted finds out about the affair, and the next day he talks to Eddie about it in the car. Ted informs him that he wants you to testify against Marion and discuss your offer in order to get Ruth's custody in the event of a divorce between Marion and himself. After all of this, Eddie asks Marion why he is still with Ted. Marion responds that Ted is a great parent and takes good care of Ruth. He also says that he detests Ted's painting hobby, which at first involved creating naked photos of Marion. Some days pass like this, and one night, Eddie asks Marion how their kids got hurt. After hearing this, Marion thinks about her dead sons again, and then she stays quiet. That night, while Eddie was showing pictures to Ruth, she asked if she could take one to her room. Marion said yes, but then Ruth dropped the picture, and the broken glass cut her finger. Eddie and Marion take him to the doctor. When Ted finds out, he gets really mad at Eddie.
The next day, while Marion is close with Eddie, she suddenly starts to cry. Then she tells him that she plans to leave everything soon and go away. That day, Ted asks Eddie to go to Evelyn's house and bring back all her paintings. Ted can't stop thinking about Evelyn now. Evelyn gets really mad and tells Eddie that Ted must come to see him on Friday. While this is happening, Evelyn accidentally shuts the door to her house. Then, Eddie breaks a window of his house and goes in. In the evening, Marion tells Eddie that on Friday, they will take Ted to Evelyn's house but won't bring him back. This will make it easier for Ted to come home alone in the evening. At that time, I will gather all the pictures of my sons and leave this place for good. The next day, when Eddie took Ted to Evelyn's house, she was very mad. He ripped up all the paintings Ted sent him. Then Eddie dropped Ted off at Evelyn's house and went back home. Marion sends Ruth to the doctor with Eddie because if Ruth stays here, she can't leave. Eddie goes to the photo shop after getting Ruth's stitch taken out, or he was asked to fix the broken picture. After arriving there, Eddie asks him for the picture today because she knew that when Ruth got home, she would be upset about not seeing her mother in the picture. But when Eddie asks for the picture, the manager won't give it to him. Eddie writes to them and explains everything. He tells them about his relationship with Marion, and after hearing everything, the manager also shares a picture. On the other hand, after a while, Ruth and Eddie arrive here. Ted was really mad at Eddie. Eddie tells Ted that Marion is gone forever because Marion asked him to say that. All the pictures of Marion's sons have also been taken. Now Ted doesn't have any pictures of his son. Ted was really sad about everything, and he talked to Eddie about it in the evening. That's how their kids got into an accident. That night, these people went out to have fun, and Marion, Ted, and his two sons were drunk from drinking. At that moment, the other son was behind the wheel, who didn't even have much experience behind the wheel. The car's headlight and rear light were covered with snow, as if Ted had neglected to tidy.